Hi, today we're going to talk about the process of hydraulic fracturing. By this process, the United States has been elevated in about the last decade or a little bit more to being one of the top oil and natural gas producers. But it's a fairly controversial process with some economic benefits to the United States, but also some environmental and human health risk associated with it. So I think that we need to understand a little bit about the process to be able to have an informed opinion. Okay. So hydraulic fracturing is a process by which more difficult to access oil and natural gas reserves can be attained. We do this by the propagation of fractures in a rock layer caused by pressurized fluids. So, in order for the process to occur, and we'll talk about this more in depth, fracturing fluids have to be injected underground at very, very high pressures that will cause fractures in hard rock formations that will release tightly held oil and natural gas. Okay. It can also be used for extraction from porous formations like the shale oil that we talked about from the Green River Formation in northwestern Colorado, northeastern Utah, and southern Wyoming. So for hydraulic fracturing, we consider low volume wells to have between 20 and 80,000 gallons per well, and high volume wells, and of course the high volume ones are the ones that are being really utilized across the United States and some other parts of the world, are the ones that have around 2 to 3 million gallons per well. Okay. So when we look at the history of hydraulic fracturing, the process was first performed in Texas in 1947. So this was at towards the end of World War II. Back then, the only way that they could access the oil was via vertical drills. So you had to make a lot of vertical drills to access oil from different reservoirs, which made it a fairly expensive process to do. At the same time, as we talked about earlier, post-World War II, the United States became the dominant foreign power in the Middle East to access Middle Eastern oil to meet our industrial demands and as a geostrategic tool during the Cold War. Middle Eastern oil cost a lot less to import than fracking did. So fracking became a lot less popular here in the United States. That said, Halliburton Corporation performed two of the first commercial operations in Oklahoma and Texas in 1949. By the 1970s, the United States Department of Energy pioneered massive fracking. The reason for this was, of course, the 1973 OPEC oil embargo against the United States for supporting the nation of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. This resulted in the embargo against the United States by OPEC countries, where prices of oil spiked and there was oil rationing. So it was at that time that the United States started realizing that being dependent on Middle Eastern countries for our oil supplies was not necessarily in our best interest, and we started looking internally. But it was still a fairly expensive process to do, and the oil embargo ended, so it was dropped. Until the 1980s, when horizontal drilling technology came about. Now, via horizontal drilling technology, a single vertical drill can be made, and then many horizontal drills can be made off of that single vertical drill, like the spokes on a bicycle. So via horizontal drilling, fracking became much, much more economically viable, and it's now performed in many United States. Okay. So some of the biggest reserves in the United States, and we'll look at a map of this. The Marcellus Formation goes from the state of New York all the way south to West Virginia, with estimates of about 50 to 84 trillion cubic feet of recoverable both liquid petroleum and natural gas. The Bakken Formation in North Dakota is one of the largest fracking areas across the United States. There's also fracking sites in Ohio and Illinois. The Barnett Formation, which is in Texas, a little bit west of Dallas, is being exploited at a very high rate. The Mancos and Baxter Formations in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, in other words, the same places that there are shale oil, are also being exploited. The fracking oil and natural gas is at a much deeper level than the shale oil reserves. There's also quite a bit of fracking going on across New Mexico, California, Oklahoma, and along the Gulf Coast. So if we look at a map of the United States and see where the major fracking sites are, we've got the Marcellus Formation up from New York to West Virginia, across Pennsylvania. We've got the Bakken Formation up here in far western North Dakota and a little bit into eastern Montana. Wyoming is covered with potential fracking oil and natural gas reserves, as is this northeastern corner of Utah and the northwestern corner of Colorado. There's also significant fracking going on in the eastern plains in Colorado, all the way up along the front range of the Rocky Mountains, across southern Kansas, into all of the state of Oklahoma pretty much, and as we can see, much of Texas, where we've got the formation here that's just a little bit west of Dallas, into far west Texas, which has traditionally been an oil-rich area of the United States, and then down in the Gulf Coast region, over into a little bit of the western side of Louisiana. So there are considerable fracking sites across the United States. Okay. So the fracking process, initially, okay, drills are made between 5,000 to 20,000 feet below the surface of the earth. So, for reference, a mile is a little bit over 5,000 feet. So we're going a couple of miles potentially below the surface of the earth. A single well is drilled vertically and casings are installed around it. And then many horizontal drills are made from that one vertical, covering a much greater area, which is what's made hydraulic fracturing economically viable now in the United States. Okay. Once those drills are made and the casings are installed, a high pressure fracture fluid is pumped down into the well bore. And we'll talk in a minute about exactly what materials are in that fracture fluid. Okay. At these extremely high pressures, rock formations begin to crack, so that oil and natural gas that were held inside those rock formations are now freed up and allowed to flow up to the surface where they're captured. Proppant, which is primarily sand or other sand-type particles with some other chemicals, are injected and maintained at high pressures to keep the fractures from closing, and then the oil and natural gas are flow upwards to a well where they are collected. So as I said, this is a very controversial process across the United States and across the rest of the world. So there's pros and cons to the hydraulic fracturing process. for the United States, as if you remember back from the map that we just looked at, there are a huge number of fracking sites with a lot of oil reserves across the United States. So because of this technology, the United States is considered to be the next Saudi Arabia of natural gas and oil. And if you remember back from our early conversations about oil, the United States has risen from, oil and natural gas being very low on where it sits in with respect to many other countries in the world in terms of productivity, to being one of the most productive countries. So the United States is now one of the top global oil producers and one of the top natural gas producers. So this has definitely caused some improvements in the U.S. economy. Tens of thousands of U.S. jobs have been created. If you've ever been across North Dakota, the economic development there is huge because a lot of infrastructure has had to be built to provide housing and other things for the oil workers moving out there to go to work. What this really means also is less imported oil for the United States. And we were reminded by the OPEC oil embargo that less reliance on foreign oil is a good thing. And with continued volatility across Middle Eastern oil-producing countries, the more we can rely internally on our own oil resources, the better off we're going to be. One of the other benefits of fracking is that across the United States, natural gas is replacing coal in electrical power production in many places. And while it's still not helping immensely with the problem of global climate change, combustion of natural gas has many, many fewer emissions than combustion of coal. So the United States has actually seen our CO2 releases go down because of this switch to natural gas. Now that being said, there are a lot of concerns with the fracking process. One of them is that fracking consumes a lot of water. So the fracture fluid that is injected at these very high pressures is primarily water. And when you inject water underground into hard rock and soft rock formations, a lot of that water is going to be lost. And if we look at the regions of the country where hydraulic fracturing is being done considerably, so the western part of North Dakota, the eastern part of Montana, that Green River Formation, Wyoming, West Texas, all the way up through the area that is just west of Dallas. These are areas of the country that are already water scarce. So consuming a lot of water in areas that are water scarce causes problems in terms of not having that water to use for agriculture or domestic purposes. Because of the chemicals that are injected into the water that's used as a fracture fluid, the water from fracking processes contains toxic and carcinogenic chemicals. So because the injection requires very, very high pressures to fracture rocks, those fractured rocks then cause fissures that move upward through a soil profile. And over a number of different underground fracturing explosions, those underground fissures can grow, allowing this fracture fluid with toxic, carcinogenic, highly flammable chemicals to contaminate groundwater supplies that humans rely on for drinking water supplies. So this is a significant problem, and we've seen across New York and Pennsylvania, where a lot of fracturing has been done in the last decade, water contamination has definitely been noted, to the extent that in the state of New York, hydraulic fracturing is no longer allowed in areas where the groundwater is part of the water supply for New York City and other big cities, because it would be a humanitarian and ecological disaster to contaminate the water supplies for a city the size of New York. There's also earthquakes associated with the fracturing process. Now, surprisingly, the earthquakes are not necessarily associated with the actual high pressure injection of the fracking fluid, but they are more associated with the storage of the used fracturing fluid after the process. But the rate of earthquakes in some parts of North Texas and Oklahoma are 100 times what they were before fracturing was started in these areas. Some of these earthquakes cause damages to home and fundamental infrastructure in cities and suburbs that are in the vicinity of frac sites, to the degree that some people's homes have been rendered unlivable. There's also a huge problem of air pollution around fracking sites. In some areas, the fracking is primarily done to recover oil reserves. And until very recently, natural gas that would also be released was just being flared. There's a number of problems associated with that. Natural gas is methane, which is also a very potent global climate change gas. When you flare it, you also produce CO2. So you're producing a lot of global climate change gases, and a lot of these are transported, obviously, in the areas around fracking site, and they contribute to photochemical smog, which we'll talk about in the environmental effects. So even though some of these areas where we're doing fracking in western North Dakota, eastern Montana, far west Texas are pretty remote rural areas, those areas are now seeing the type of air pollution that's associated with big cities. So to understand fracturing, we really need to understand some fundamental things about the fracture fluid. Again, this is primarily water that's used to extend the fractures. It carries a sand propellant, which helps keep the rock formations open. Some of the other things that we know are in the fracturing fluids are gelling agents, polymers, pH modifiers, oxidizers, CO2, in nitrogen, and hydrochloric and other acids. Now, these are worrisome, but these aren't nearly as worrisome to us as the things that we don't necessarily know are in the fracking fluids. So across the United States, there are up to 650 chemicals that are regulated by the Safe Water Drinking Act. The Safe Water Drinking Act is exactly what it sounds like. It was enacted in the U.S. Congress in the 1970s to make sure that water supplies are not contaminated in a way that would make our drinking water supplies dangerous or unhealthy for us. The fracking industry, the oil companies involved in the fracking industry, all have about 279 products that have at least one key ingredient that's listed as proprietary, which means they do not have to report what these chemicals are to the Environmental Protection Agency. So there are a lot of chemicals in these fracking fluids that we don't even really know what they are. Now, some of the things that we do know about them as classes of chemicals, some are known carcinogens, some are toxins, some are neurotoxins, which can cause brain damage. Things like benzene, lead, methanol, radioactive tracers have all been found in these fracking fluids. So there's a lot of concern with contaminated drinking water supplies. Unfortunately, when fracking first started getting done in the 1990s on a fairly large scale in the United States under the Bush administration in the 1990s into the 2000s. The hydraulic fracturing process was made exempt from the Clean Water Act, the Safe Water Drinking Act, and the Clean Air Act that governs all other industry. So the fracking industry is allowed to release pollutants into groundwater and surface water supplies and into the air that all other industries in the United States are not allowed to do. So clearly, from a public health and from an environmental health perspective, this is of great concern. So some of the bigger environmental concerns associated with hydraulic fracturing, the following things have been documented: groundwater contamination and migration of chemicals to the surface, getting into well water that sits between the depth at which fracking is happening all the way up to the surface of the earth. One of the issues with this is that the fracking industry does test the water in wells where they're fracking to prove that the wells are not being contaminated, but they test the water after the first fracking explosion. And before a fracking well is completely exhausted, there can be, 20 different underground fracturing explosions. So it's never the first one that's going to cause enough fissures for these contaminants to make their way up to groundwater supplies. It's going to be the 6th or the 7th or the 10th. But the fracking industry is not testing the water supplies at that point. Independent people and agencies who have pulled groundwater supplies are finding groundwater contamination. In some areas of Pennsylvania, it's been bad enough that people have documented that the water coming out of the faucets in their house has so much natural gas entrained in it that you can light the fire as the water as it's coming out of the pipeline. And clearly water with this level of contamination is toxic to humans and the environment. Again, around fracking sites, air quality is as bad as it is in cities where you've got a lot of industry and a lot of vehicular traffic. So rural air quality around fracking sites is being severely compromised. There has been a lot of mishandling of waste because, again, the Bush administration made the process exempt from the Clean Water Act, the Safe Water Drinking Act, and the Clean Air Act. So surface lands have also been contaminated across North Dakota, Montana, etc. And these are in areas that are either highly agricultural in terms of raising crops or in terms of raising cattle. So there's a lot of health effects obviously associated with breathing dirty air and drinking water that isn't clean. And there's also the possible of blowouts and explosions at fracking sites that makes this one of the more dangerous jobs for the oil workers on those sites. So now we understand a little bit about the fracking process, and I think one of our upcoming discussions is whether or not fracking should be allowed in the United States, why or why not, and if so, under which regulations. So this should give you a little bit of information to work with when you're weighing in on your opinion on that. So we'll leave off now and we will talk about some other fossil fuel technologies in our next lectures.